You're tuned into 22 Crime, where the truth hides in the details. Together we dive into the darkest corners of human nature, exploring the mysteries that have left investigators puzzled and families searching for justice. Because in the world of crime, the truth is never as simple as it seems. The clock is ticking. Let's uncover the truth behind today's mystery. In today's episode, we're going to peel back the layers of this disturbing case. We'll take you step by step through the timeline of events, unravel the key details of her so-called abduction, and uncover the lies that would eventually come crashing down. You'll hear from those who were closest to the case, including new revelations from Keith Papini, Sherri's ex-husband, who, for years, remained silent about the woman he once thought he knew. Stay with us as we uncover how one woman's deception spiraled out of control, affecting not just her family but countless lives across the country. This is the story of Sherri Papini, an abduction that wasn't. Viewer discretion is advised. 22 is a true crime podcast that delves into real-life crime stories, which often involve graphic descriptions, sensitive content, and strong language that may not be suitable for all audiences. We strive to present these cases with the utmost respect for the victims and their families. Please note that the content discussed may be distressing or triggering for some listeners. Additionally, all resources and information presented in this podcast are obtained from publicly available internet sources. Listener discretion is strongly advised, and we recommend that only mature audiences proceed with caution. If you are sensitive to such content, please consider watching another video. Stay safe and take care of your mental health. November 2nd, 2016. It was a typical fall morning in Redding, California. A quiet, suburban town surrounded by natural beauty, with picturesque trails, lush parks, and a sense of security that its residents rarely questioned. For the Papini family, it was supposed to be just another day. Sherri Papini, a 34-year-old stay-at-home mother, started her morning like any other, getting her kids ready for their day and planning her own. She had a 4-year-old son, Tyler, and a 2-year-old daughter, Violet. Keith, her husband of 7 years, left for his job at Best Buy, where he worked as a home theater specialist. By all accounts, their life seemed like a dream, a family living the American suburban ideal. But as the day progressed, the cracks began to show. At around 10 a.m., Sherri sent Keith an unusual text message. It was playful, maybe even flirtatious. She suggested that he come home for lunch, and more. But Keith, buried under work, texted back that he couldn't make it. It seemed like a small, innocuous moment, one that might play out in countless households across the country. But looking back, it was the last ordinary exchange Keith would have with his wife that day. Sherri's plan for the afternoon was simple. After spending some time at home, she decided to go for a jog, something she often did along the familiar trails near their house. She had been training for a 5K marathon, determined to regain her fitness after recovering from a cosmetic surgery. The route she chose, Old Oregon Trail, was one she had run countless times before. It was peaceful, isolated, and the perfect place to clear her mind. Or so it seemed. But then, she vanished. Keith returned home from work that evening, expecting to find his wife and children waiting for him, but the house was eerily quiet. There was no sign of Sherri, and their children hadn't been picked up from daycare, a task Sherri never forgot. Instinctively, a sense of panic began to build in Keith's chest. He knew something was wrong. He immediately called the daycare. His children were still there, waiting to be picked up, but their mother had never shown. Keith then tried to call Sherri's phone, but each attempt went straight to voicemail. His heart raced as he dialed again, hoping for an answer that never came. Desperation started to set in. That's when Keith remembered the Find My iPhone app, a tool that could track Sherri's phone. With trembling hands, he opened the app, praying it would give him a clue. And it did. Sherri's phone was still nearby, but what Keith discovered next was something that no husband should ever have to face. The phone's location led Keith to a spot about a mile from their home, near Sunrise Drive and Old Oregon Trail, the same path Sherri had been jogging that day. As he approached the area, his worst fears began to materialize. Lying on the ground, as if carelessly discarded, was Sherri's phone. But there was something else, something that sent a chill down his spine. Wrapped around the phone were her earbuds, and tangled in the wires was a clump of her long blonde hair. It looked like it had been pulled out, as if in a violent struggle. Keith's mind raced, his thoughts spiraling out of control. Had his wife been attacked? Had someone taken her? In that moment, Keith knew this was more than just a case of his wife going for a run and losing track of time. This was something far more sinister. With no time to lose, Keith immediately called 911. His voice, shaky and filled with panic, was the first chilling glimpse into the horror that was unfolding. Keith, so I just got home from work and, my wife wasn't there, which is unusual. My kids should have been there by now, from daycare. And, I couldn't find her, so I called the daycare. The kids were never picked up. And now I'm here, at the end of our driveway, and I just found her phone. It's got, hair ripped out of it. I think something happened to her. I'm freaking out. Dispatcher. Sir, I understand. Where exactly did you find her phone? Keith. It's right here. At the end of Sunrise and Old Oregon Trail. I don't know what's going on. Within minutes, local police were on the scene, and a search for Sherri Papini officially began. The quiet community of Redding, where the most excitement might be a weekend farmer's market, was suddenly thrust into the center of a growing mystery. Flyers were printed and distributed, helicopters circled overhead, and search parties canvassed the area with scent dogs. But something strange happened. The dogs couldn't pick up a trail. There were no obvious signs of a struggle, no footprints, and no witnesses. It was as if Sherri had simply vanished into thin air. The story quickly gained traction in the media. A 34-year-old mother of two disappearing in broad daylight while out on a routine jog, it was every woman's worst fear come to life. News outlets ran segments on her disappearance, and social media buzzed with speculation. Who would take Sherri? Why? As the hours turned into days, desperation grew. Keith, exhausted and terrified, turned to the public for help. He launched a GoFundMe page to raise money for private investigators, hoping anyone could help him find his wife. The donations poured in. Within days, the fund had raised nearly $50,000. The pressure was mounting to find Sherri before it was too late. A self-proclaimed hostage negotiator and kidnap and ransom consultant. Out of nowhere, Gamble appeared on the scene, offering his services pro bono. He claimed he could help negotiate Sherri's safe return, should her abductors demand a ransom. Gamble inserted himself into the heart of the investigation, speaking directly to the media and the public, and even announcing that an anonymous donor had come forward with a hefty reward for Sherri's safe return. He speculated that Sherri had been taken for human trafficking and that her captors were weighing their options. He even set deadlines for her release, publicly pleading with her supposed kidnappers to return her unharmed. But not everyone welcomed Gamble's involvement. His sudden appearance raised eyebrows. Was he truly there to help, or was he just another opportunist capitalizing on the media frenzy? Regardless of the skepticism surrounding him, his presence only fueled the growing mystery. Was Sherri Papini a victim of a random abduction? Or was something far more complex lurking beneath the surface? As the days turned into weeks, Sherri's family, her friends, and her community were left in a state of limbo, gripped by fear and uncertainty. Where was Sherri, and who had taken her? Little did they know, the answers were about to come, answers that would turn everything they believed upside down. It was the early morning hours of Thanksgiving Day, November 24, 2016. Most families in California were still asleep, resting before the holiday festivities began, except for one man, a motorist driving along Interstate 5 in Yolo County, about 150 miles from Redding, California. It was there, on the side of the road, that he saw something that would change the course of the investigation. A woman, disoriented, bruised, and visibly terrified, was wandering alongside the highway. She was dirty, emaciated, and had her long blonde hair roughly cut. The motorist immediately pulled over, recognizing the woman from the news. This was Sherri Papini, the missing mother of two who had vanished 3 weeks earlier. Her reappearance, once believed impossible, was nothing short of miraculous. But as police rushed to the scene, it would quickly become apparent that her story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. Sherri Papini was in bad shape. She was wearing gray sweatpants, a sweatshirt, and the same underwear from the day she disappeared. Around her waist, a chain was fastened, and her wrists were bruised and bound with zip ties. Her body was battered, bruises and cuts littered her skin, her nose was broken, and a strange branding marked her right shoulder. The image was horrifying. It was the kind of sight you'd expect from a victim who had endured unimaginable torment. Sherri was taken to a local hospital where she was treated for her injuries. Her weight had dropped dramatically. She was down to just 87 pounds, severely malnourished. She seemed to be in a state of shock, barely able to comprehend what had happened. As doctors and law enforcement scrambled to assess her condition, Sherri began to speak. She revealed that she had been abducted and held captive by two Hispanic women who had tortured her for weeks. According to Sherri, she had been taken while jogging on November 2nd. The women, masked and speaking in Spanish, had driven her away in a dark SUV. They kept her bound in a room with boarded-up windows, forcing her to listen to loud, blaring Mexican music while they starved and abused her. Sherri claimed the women had cut her hair, branded her shoulder with a hot iron, and subjected her to unimaginable cruelty. They had even threatened her life, saying she would be sold to a police officer. It was only after weeks of enduring this torment, she said, that they decided to release her, driving her to the spot on Interstate 5 where she was found, throwing her out of the vehicle like she was nothing. It was a harrowing story, one of survival against all odds. To many, Sherri Papini was now a symbol of hope. But to others, her story had just a few too many holes. In the immediate aftermath of Sherri's reappearance, the reaction was one of pure relief and celebration. For 3 agonizing weeks, the community of Reading had been holding its breath, clinging to the hope that Sherri would return home safely. Now, here she was, a survivor. Her ordeal had captured the hearts of the nation, and her miraculous return seemed like something out of a movie. The media hailed Sherri as a symbol of resilience. She was the woman who had been stolen from her family but fought her way back. The details of her captivity spread like wildfire. News outlets ran headlines detailing her abuse and the chilling details of her escape. Her story was everywhere, from morning talk shows to late-night news programs, and public sympathy for Sherri poured in from every corner. But the celebration was not without its shadows. Behind the scenes, investigators were digging deeper, and questions about Sherri's story were beginning to emerge. Keith Papini, who had been the most vocal advocate for finding his wife, was overwhelmed with emotion. He had been on the front lines of the search, pleading with the public, coordinating efforts, and pushing the media to keep the story alive. Now his efforts had paid off. His wife was home. Keith quickly became the public face of the family, speaking on behalf of Sherri and sharing his gratitude with the world. In a statement released through Good Morning America, Keith described his relief and the trauma his wife had endured. He spoke of Sherri's horrific injuries, how her nose had been broken, how she had been starved and branded, and how her once beautiful blonde hair had been hacked away by her captors. It was clear that Keith was still reeling from the nightmare, but his love and support for Sherri were unwavering. Keith, nothing could have prepared me for what I saw when I walked into the hospital room and saw her, the bruises, the scabs, the swelling. Her face was so covered in bruises I could barely recognize her, but her blue eyes, those eyes made it her. Sherri was finally back. The public felt Keith's pain and his relief. He had been the loving husband, the devoted father, who had never given up on his wife. To many, his commitment to Sherri was nothing short of heroic. As Sherri recovered at home, the search for her abductors intensified. The description she gave of the two Hispanic women, one older, one younger, along with their dark SUV, became the focus of law enforcement efforts. Investigators scoured the area, looking for any leads. The FBI joined forces with local authorities to widen the search, poring over hundreds of tips that poured in from around the country. After all, if these women could kidnap Sherri Papini in broad daylight, who would be next? At the same time, Keith and Sherri's story continued to tug at the public's heartstrings. Sherri had been taken just miles from her home, from her children, and the idea that this could happen to anyone resonated with people across the country. Women, especially mothers, empathized with Sherri, imagining themselves in her shoes. It was every parent's nightmare. The community of Reading rallied behind the Papini family. A GoFundMe page set up to help fund the search for Sherri had raised nearly $50,000 before her return, and now those funds would go toward her recovery. People sent their prayers, their well wishes, and their donations, all hoping to help the Papinis in any way they could. But as the days went on, something else started to bubble beneath the surface. Quiet whispers among the public and the police, questions that couldn't be ignored. Was Sherri Papini really the victim of a terrifying abduction? Or was there something far more sinister at play? In the immediate aftermath of Sherri Papini's return, her story was taken at face value, an unimaginable ordeal at the hands of two faceless captors. But as the days went by and investigators dug deeper, something started to unravel. Sherri's account of what had happened to her was compelling and detailed in some ways, but curiously vague in others. From the start, investigators had noticed that Sherri's descriptions of the two Hispanic women who allegedly kidnapped her were frustratingly thin. She couldn't recall any specific facial features. She didn't remember much about the interior of the house where she was supposedly held. All she could offer was that one woman was older, one younger, and that they spoke Spanish and kept her in a room with boarded-up windows. No further details. This lack of clarity seemed odd for someone who had been held captive for 22 days. The investigators, experienced in such cases, found it unusual that after such a long period of time, Sherri had almost no specific recollections about her surroundings. No furniture, no distinctive sounds, no smells except for an occasional sewage odor she mentioned. How could a woman who had endured such a horrific ordeal be so vague about her captors and her environment? Still, her physical injuries, the broken nose, bruises, the branding, seemed to support her claims of abuse. But the gaps in her memory, the fogginess surrounding her captivity, gnawed at the investigators. They were trained to listen closely, to pick apart inconsistencies, and to look for details that either made sense or didn't. And slowly, they began to find more of the latter. One of the first major red flags appeared when Sherri recounted the moment of her abduction. She described walking on Old Oregon Trail, a quiet rural area, when a dark SUV pulled up. The two women inside, both wearing masks, reportedly forced her into the vehicle at gunpoint. But here's where things became strange. When police combed the area, they found several witnesses who had seen Sherri jogging that day, but no one had seen a suspicious vehicle or any sign of a struggle. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. Furthermore, there were inconsistencies in her timeline. Sherri couldn't seem to recall certain critical details of the abduction, like exactly when and where she was grabbed, or how long the drive lasted when she was taken to her captor's house. These details shifted in various retellings, raising suspicion among investigators. Sherri's failure to pinpoint locations or provide consistent descriptions cast doubt on the narrative she was spinning. Even the physical evidence, the phone found neatly placed on the ground, the earbuds entangled with strands of her hair, began to look staged. Why would kidnappers take the time to carefully leave behind these items? And why would Sherri, in such a panicked moment, manage to leave behind her hair so neatly entangled in the earbuds? For detectives, these weren't just minor lapses in memory. They were significant, especially in a case as high-profile as this one. Something about Sherri's story wasn't adding up, and they began to quietly voice their concerns behind the scenes. The investigation took a dramatic turn when forensic evidence from Sherri's clothing came back from the lab. Investigators had meticulously collected samples from the sweatpants and sweatshirt Sherri was wearing when she was found. They were expecting to find traces of her captors, but what they found instead was a bombshell. 2 sets of DNA were discovered. One was female, likely belonging to Sherri herself, but the second set, it belonged to a man. This revelation was puzzling for several reasons. Sherri had maintained that she was abducted by 2 women. No men had been involved, according to her. So how could male DNA end up on her clothing? And even more puzzling, the DNA didn't match her husband Keith, the person closest to her. This discovery raised more questions than answers. If Keith wasn't involved, then who was? The DNA evidence was a turning point. It didn't just cast doubt on Sherri's account, it began to dismantle it. As these inconsistencies in the DNA findings surfaced, the media, which had initially embraced Sherri's story of survival, began to turn skeptical. Blogs and news outlets that had once praised Sherri for her bravery now started to ask the uncomfortable questions, questions that had been whispered in the halls of police stations but were now spilling into the public sphere. Speculation about the possibility of a hoax began to grow. The idea seemed far-fetched at first. After all, why would someone fake such a traumatic event? But the more people looked at the case, the more plausible it seemed. Some began to speculate that Sherri had staged her own abduction for attention, or perhaps for financial gain. Others theorized that she had been trying to escape something, perhaps her own life, and had concocted this elaborate story to cover her tracks. The police, meanwhile, were treading carefully. Publicly, they maintained that they believed Sherri's story, but behind closed doors, their doubts were multiplying. Detectives had invested countless hours into the investigation, chasing down leads that were starting to feel like dead ends. And with no real evidence pointing to the mysterious Hispanic women Sherri described, it was becoming harder to ignore the growing suspicion that something was terribly off about this entire case. The public, once firmly in Sherri's corner, was now divided. Some still saw her as a victim, a woman who had endured unimaginable pain and suffering. Others were beginning to question her credibility, especially in light of the male DNA discovery. Had Sherri really been the victim of a heinous crime, or was there something more insidious at play? As the days passed, the whispers grew louder, the suspicions deeper. Investigators knew they had to keep pushing, to keep digging for the truth, no matter how shocking that truth might turn out to be. By August 2020, the investigation into Sherri Papini's alleged abduction was at a crossroads. The public still didn't know it, but behind closed doors, the police were growing more and more skeptical of her story. The evidence wasn't aligning with Sherri's narrative, and there was one particularly troubling piece of the puzzle that couldn't be ignored: the male DNA found on Sherri's clothing. After running the DNA through national databases with no immediate matches, investigators took a different approach. They utilized a method similar to familial DNA searching, a technique that can identify relatives of an individual by comparing genetic profiles. What they found led them down a new path. The DNA didn't match any known criminal, but it led them to someone much closer to Sherri than anyone had initially imagined: James Reyes, Sherri's ex-boyfriend. This discovery was a breakthrough. But more than that, it would unravel everything Sherri had claimed. When law enforcement approached James Reyes, they were ready for another dead end, maybe another denial. But what they got instead was a confession, one that turned the entire case on its head. Reyes didn't hesitate. He admitted to knowing exactly where Sherri had been during the 22 days she was supposedly missing, because she hadn't been kidnapped at all. She had been staying with him. For detectives, this was a bombshell. Not only did it contradict Sherri's dramatic tale of abduction and torture, but it confirmed what they had begun to suspect, that this entire ordeal had been a lie. So, what really happened? According to James Reyes, the story began not with a random kidnapping on a rural trail, but with a phone call from Sherri in late October of 2016. Reyes hadn't seen Sherri in years, but they had a history. They had dated long ago, and though they had moved on with their lives, Sherri reached out to him, asking for help. She claimed her life with her husband, Keith, was unbearable. She said he was abusive, and she needed to escape. Reyes believed her. He hadn't kept close contact with Sherri, but he still cared for her, and if she needed help, he was willing to give it. So, when Sherri asked him to pick her up, he didn't hesitate. On the day of her abduction, November 2, 2016, Reyes rented a car and drove several hours from his home in Costa Mesa to Redding, California. He followed Sherri's instructions, driving to a prearranged spot where she was waiting for him. This wasn't a dramatic kidnapping scene on an open trail. It was a quiet, planned rendezvous. Sherri got into his car without saying much. According to Reyes, she seemed anxious but determined. She didn't tell him the full scope of her plan, only that she needed to get away from her husband. The two of them drove back to Reyes' home, a small apartment in Southern California, where Sherri would spend the next 3 weeks while the nation frantically searched for her. During those 22 days, Sherri Papini lived in relative comfort. She wasn't chained up or held against her will. In fact, Reyes said she was free to do whatever she pleased. She had access to his home, cleaned his apartment, and even cut her hair, something she later claimed her captors had done as part of her abuse. Reyes described how Sherri settled in, making herself at home while he went to work during the day. But it wasn't all peaceful. Reyes told investigators that Sherri was under a lot of stress, constantly fretting about how to make her disappearance look believable. She seemed obsessed with crafting a convincing story, and according to Reyes, she even went so far as to injure herself. At one point, Sherri asked Reyes for help. She wanted him to brand her skin. Reyes, feeling uneasy but still under the impression that he was helping her, reluctantly agreed. He went to a local hardware store, bought a branding tool, and marked Sherri's shoulder. This was the same branding Sherri would later use as evidence of her captivity. It didn't stop there. Reyes recalled how Sherri injured herself in other ways, creating bruises and scratches on her body to match the narrative she would later tell the world. She was meticulous, ensuring every detail aligned with the violent kidnapping scenario she was preparing to unveil. Reyes, in his own words, was caught up in the whirlwind, too naive or too loyal to question her increasingly bizarre behavior. But as the days dragged on, even Reyes began to feel the weight of Sherri's lies. She became increasingly paranoid, worrying that they would be found out or that the story wouldn't hold up once she resurfaced. According to Reyes, the stress was taking a toll on her. She stopped eating properly and spent hours obsessing over the details of her eventual escape. Then, one day, Sherri told Reyes it was time for her to go back. The plan, whatever it had been, was coming to an end. Reyes didn't ask many questions, he simply did as Sherri asked. He rented another car, packed her up, and drove her partway back toward Redding. At some point, they pulled over on a desolate road near Yolo County, about 150 miles from her home. Sherri got out, taking a bag filled with items she had prepared to make her escape look convincing, plaster restraints, the clothes she had been wearing, and the chains that would later be found on her when she was rescued. With that, Reyes drove away. He watched in the rearview mirror as Sherri stood by the side of the road, preparing to stage her own discovery. Now, many of you listening may be wondering the same thing investigators did. Why did James Reyes go along with this? Why would he help Sherri pull off such an elaborate hoax, especially one that risked so much? According to Reyes, he truly believed Sherri was in danger. She had convinced him that she was fleeing an abusive husband and that this was the only way she could start over. In his mind, he was her savior, giving her a chance to escape a bad situation. He had no idea the extent of her lies or the chaos they would cause. And once he was involved, it became harder and harder to pull away. During the interview, Reyes maintained that he had no idea Sherri would take things so far. He didn't know about the GoFundMe page that had raised nearly $50,000. He didn't know about the nationwide media coverage or the police resources being used to search for her. He certainly didn't know that Sherri had taken money from California's Victim Compensation Fund. In his mind, he had simply helped a friend. But by the time Sherri's hoax unraveled, it was clear that he had been part of something far bigger and far more damaging than he had ever imagined. Once James Reyes' confession was on record, the case against Sherri Papini began to solidify. Her story of abduction, so carefully constructed, was falling apart piece by piece. And the revelation that she had been staying with her ex-boyfriend the entire time sent shockwaves through both the public and the authorities. This wasn't just a simple lie, it was a hoax of massive proportions, one that had wasted time, resources, and perhaps worst of all, shattered the trust of everyone who had supported her. As the investigation closed in, it was becoming clear that the story Sherri had told, a story of terror, captivity, and survival, had been nothing more than a carefully crafted illusion. But the question remained, why? Why had she gone to such lengths? What could possibly have driven her to concoct such a cruel and elaborate scheme? By early 2022, the walls of Sherri Papini's elaborate lie were closing in. The truth had been uncovered through DNA evidence, testimony from her ex-boyfriend James Reyes, and the tireless efforts of law enforcement. And yet, up until this point, Sherri had stuck to her story, refusing to admit what she had done. That changed in March of 2022. On March 3, 2022, nearly 6 years after her alleged abduction, federal agents arrived at Sherri's home with an arrest warrant. The charges? Making false statements to federal officers and committing mail fraud. It was a staggering fall from grace for the woman who had once been seen as a symbol of survival, a mother and wife whose story of endurance had gripped the entire nation. Now she was being led away in handcuffs, with the weight of her deception finally catching up to her. The charges she faced were serious, particularly the mail fraud, which carried a potential sentence of up to 20 years in prison. But this wasn't just about the legal consequences. This was about justice for everyone Sherri had hurt in the process. Law enforcement agencies, victim compensation funds, and ordinary citizens had rallied around her, investing time, money, and resources in a story that turned out to be nothing more than a hoax. As the investigation had revealed, Sherri's hoax didn't just waste police resources, it cost real money. Part of the reason for her arrest was the $309,000 in restitution she now owed to various organizations. This included $150,000 to the California Victim Compensation Board, an organization that had dispersed funds to Sherri for therapy, medical treatments, and security measures, all expenses related to her alleged abduction and its traumatic aftermath. Sherri had taken advantage of the system designed to support genuine victims of violent crime, leaving the board to pick up the pieces. Another $128,000 went to the Shasta County Sheriff's Office and the FBI, both of which had devoted significant time and manpower to finding her supposed kidnappers. Sherri's lie had mobilized search teams, detectives, and forensic experts, all working tirelessly to solve a crime that had never even happened. Finally, there was the Social Security Administration, to which she owed $30,000. Sherri had applied for disability benefits in the wake of her abduction, claiming she was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder and other related issues. In reality, the trauma was fabricated, and the funds she had received under false pretenses would now have to be repaid. It was a stunning financial toll, one that mirrored the emotional toll Sherri's deception had inflicted on her community, her family, and beyond. As if the misuse of public funds wasn't enough, Sherri had also taken advantage of the kindness of strangers. Shortly after her disappearance, her husband Keith, desperate for answers, had launched a GoFundMe campaign to help raise money for private investigators in search efforts. The response had been overwhelming. Friends, family, and concerned citizens donated generously, eventually raising nearly $49,000. The funds were supposed to go toward finding Sherri, but in reality, after her return, they went towards something very different. Instead of reimbursing the search efforts or paying for therapy for the trauma she never endured, Sherri and Keith used the GoFundMe money to pay off personal debts and credit card bills. It was a betrayal of trust that left many who had donated feeling not just misled, but furious. As part of her legal consequences, Sherri was ordered to pay back the money she had essentially stolen from these well-meaning contributors. The image of a community coming together to support a family in need had been shattered by the revelation that Sherri had exploited their generosity for her own selfish ends. For Keith Papini, Sherri's arrest was a final, devastating blow. In the years leading up to her arrest, Keith had stood by his wife, fiercely defending her story. He had believed in her completely, had even made emotional public statements about his relief when she was found alive. To him, Sherri was the victim of a horrendous crime, and as her husband, he had been prepared to fight for justice on her behalf. But when the truth came out, it blindsided him. The woman he had trusted, loved, and shared a life with had been lying to him for years. Everything he thought he knew about their life together, Sherri's kidnapping, her trauma, their shared journey to recovery, had been a lie. In a letter filed with the court, Keith detailed the deep emotional wounds left by Sherri's actions. He described how the revelation of the hoax had shattered their family, not only for him but for their children. His trust in her had been completely destroyed, and he realized he could no longer remain in the marriage. Shortly after Sherri's arrest, Keith made the difficult decision to file for divorce. In his filing, he wrote, "Now that I have learned the truth, as have so many others, I must act decisively to protect my children from the trauma caused by their mother." He sought sole custody of their 2 children, arguing that Sherri's actions had proven she was unfit to be a responsible parent. For Keith, the decision was heartbreaking, but it was also necessary. The divorce wasn't just about protecting his children, it was about rebuilding his life. Keith had been dragged into a nightmare of lies and public scrutiny, all because of Sherri's manipulations. He had been made to look like a fool, defending a wife who had fabricated an elaborate story for reasons he still couldn't fully comprehend. Sherri's arrest, the restitution payments, and Keith's divorce filing marked the official end of the Papini story, or at least the end of the fairy tale Sherri had so carefully crafted. Her lies had been exposed, and her once picture-perfect life had crumbled in the public eye. As Sherri faced her day in court, the community that had once rallied around her was left grappling with the aftermath. For years, her story had captivated the nation, drawing in people from all walks of life who felt connected to her plight. But in the end, it was all an illusion, a cautionary tale about the lengths some people will go to seek attention and the collateral damage they leave in their wake. For years, Keith Papini stood in the background of this bizarre and tragic story. While the media swirled with rumors and accusations, he remained steadfast, protecting his family, defending his wife, and trying to hold together the pieces of a life that had been shattered by Sherri's alleged abduction. But when the truth emerged, when the web of lies Sherri had spun began to unravel, Keith found himself facing a different kind of nightmare, the betrayal of the woman he thought he knew better than anyone. In the Hulu documentary Perfect Wife, The Mysterious Disappearance of Sherri Papini, Keith finally broke his silence. It was the first time he spoke in detail about the emotional devastation he experienced, the disbelief and confusion that plagued him as the truth about Sherri's deception came to light. This wasn't just a story about an abduction hoax, it was about a husband realizing that his marriage, his family, and his life had been built on lies. Keith had always believed in Sherri. In the documentary, he reflected on how perfect their life seemed from the outside. They had 2 beautiful children, a lovely home, and what he believed to be a strong, loving marriage. Sherri had always been affectionate, leaving him notes, writing him songs, and making him feel deeply loved. It was the kind of marriage that seemed almost too good to be true, and in the end, it was. "I did everything for her," Keith says in the documentary, his voice heavy with disbelief and pain. "There was no part of me that ever thought she could do this to me, to our kids." His words are raw, exposing the deep wound left by Sherri's betrayal. "I was blindsided, completely blindsided. I trusted her, I believed in her, and I thought she was happy. I thought we had everything." Keith's words strike at the heart of the emotional destruction caused by Sherri's hoax. He talks about the moment he found her phone and headphones, and the sickening fear that coursed through him. He genuinely believed something terrible had happened to his wife. For 3 weeks he lived in constant dread, clinging to the hope that Sherri would return home safely. And when she did, when she was rescued, he was overcome with relief. He wanted to protect her, to help her heal from what he believed had been a horrifying ordeal. But behind that relief, Keith admits that there were things that didn't add up. There were signs, he says. Things she said that didn't make sense. But I didn't want to question her. I wanted to support her. I wanted to believe her. And if you can't trust your wife, who can you trust? In that simple, heartbreaking statement, Keith reveals the depth of his inner conflict. Even as the inconsistencies in Sherri's story began to pile up, even as the media and investigators started to cast doubt on her claims, Keith remained loyal. He wanted to believe that the woman he had built his life with couldn't deceive him on such a grand scale. But as time passed and the truth became impossible to ignore, Keith found himself confronting an even darker reality. In the Hulu documentary, Keith makes a shocking revelation about Sherri's behavior, a revelation that sent a chill through everyone who heard it. According to Keith, Sherri wasn't just lying about her abduction, She was actively harming their children. Keith described a harrowing discovery he made after Sherri had been arrested and the truth about her hoax was out in the open. One night, while putting their daughter, Violet, to bed, she casually asked him if he was feeling sick. When Keith responded that he wasn't feeling well, Violet offered him a disturbing solution. "Why don't you try Mommy's trick?" Keith asked what she meant, and Violet proceeded to explain that Sherri had been soaking tissues in rubbing alcohol and having her and their brother inhale the fumes. It was a method, Violet said, that made them feel sick. Keith was horrified. He later found out that Sherri had been doing this regularly, placing alcohol-soaked tissues in bags and tying them around the children's necks so they would continue to inhale the fumes. It wasn't just an isolated incident. According to Violet, this was happening every day. The implications of this revelation are profound. It suggested a deeper level of manipulation and control on Sherri's part, a need to create an ongoing narrative of illness and victimhood, even if it meant involving her own children. Keith admitted in the documentary that he could no longer deny the truth. His wife had not only faked her own abduction, but had also been endangering their children in ways he never could have imagined. "It broke me," Keith confesses. Realizing that she had been doing this to our kids, that she was willing to make them sick for attention, for whatever reason, it was unbearable. Keith's voice cracks as he recalls this revelation. "I didn't know what to do. I just wanted to protect them. I had to protect them." As Keith processed everything that had happened, the lies, the manipulation, and the harm done to his children, he began to come to a conclusion about what had driven Sherri to such extremes. In his view, Sherri was obsessed with being seen as a victim. She craved attention, and she didn't care who she hurt in the process. "I think in the end it was all about the attention," Keith says. She wanted people to feel for her, to sympathize with her, to see her as a victim. And she didn't care what it cost, whether it was our marriage, our kids, or our whole community. She needed people to look at her and feel sorry for her. Keith describes how, even after the hoax was revealed, Sherri never showed true remorse. She continued to deny the full extent of what she had done, clinging to the role of victim, even as the evidence mounted against her. She doesn't understand the damage she caused, Keith reflects. I don't think she's capable of seeing it. The people who helped her, who believed in her, the people she hurt, they don't matter to her. All that matters is that she gets to play the victim. For Keith, speaking out was a way to reclaim his own narrative, to share his truth after years of silence. He had been manipulated, betrayed, and lied to, but now he was ready to tell his side of the story. And as he spoke, it became clear that Keith's journey, like Sherri's deception, had been long and painful. Keith Papini's story is one of deep emotional betrayal, of discovering that the person he had loved and trusted more than anyone else had been lying to him for years. It's a story of a man who tried to hold his family together, even as the foundations of that family were crumbling beneath him. And it's a story of how one woman's obsession with being seen as a victim tore apart not just her own life, but the lives of everyone around her. Keith's voice in the Hulu documentary offers a window into the emotional fallout of Sherri's actions. He isn't just a footnote in this story, he is one of its central victims, left to pick up the pieces of a life shattered by deception. And as he continues to process the events of the past several years, Keith is left with a sobering truth. The woman he loved, the woman he thought he knew, never really existed. Why would someone fake an abduction, craft a web of lies, and drag an entire community into chaos? What was Sherri Papini really after when she orchestrated one of the most bizarre hoaxes in recent history? While her actions baffled those who followed her story, psychologists and behavioral experts point to a combination of deep-seated mental health issues and a relentless need for attention as the driving forces behind her elaborate scheme. Sherri's need to be seen as a victim, to be cared for, and to remain the center of attention may have roots that stretch back far before her supposed abduction in 2016. This wasn't the first time Sherri had been involved in strange, self-destructive behavior. Reports surfaced that in 2003, Sherri had a history of self-harm, during which she falsely accused her mother of causing her injuries. She was also involved in numerous conflicts with family members, including an incident where she vandalized her father's home and kicked in her sister's back door. All of these behaviors paint a picture of someone who had been troubled for years, a person who craved attention, even if it meant hurting herself or those around her. Experts believe that Sherri's behavior could be indicative of deeper psychological issues, particularly attention-seeking disorders. One possible diagnosis that has emerged in discussions about Sherri's actions is Munchausen syndrome by proxy. While this syndrome typically involves a caregiver, often a parent, who seeks attention by causing illness or harm to someone else, usually their child, Sherri's behavior, especially the allegations of making her own children sick, could suggest a similar psychological pattern. The way she reportedly soaked tissues in rubbing alcohol and had her children inhale the fumes, potentially to make them appear ill, points to a dangerous and manipulative form of behavior aimed at garnering sympathy and concern from others. At the core of Sherri's deception lies one undeniable truth: she needed to be seen as a victim. For many who followed her story, the first question that came to mind was, why? Why would someone who had a seemingly happy family life, a loving husband, and 2 beautiful children fake such a traumatic event? The answer may be more psychological than financial. For Sherri, the attention she received after her supposed kidnapping seemed to fill an emotional void. She was no stranger to seeking the spotlight, and by positioning herself as a victim, she could draw in sympathy from friends, family, and even strangers. Keith, her husband, described how Sherri always seemed to crave validation, how she would leave him notes, write him songs, and constantly remind him how perfect their life was. But behind this need for reassurance was a darker desire to be the center of attention, even if it meant creating elaborate lies to sustain that role. Psychologists suggest that people who fake traumatic events often have histrionic personality disorder, a condition characterized by constant attention-seeking, dramatic behavior, and an overwhelming desire to be noticed. For people with this disorder, being the center of attention isn't just a desire, it's a need. And when that attention starts to fade, they may go to great lengths to recapture it. In Sherri's case, the lengths were extreme, staging her own disappearance and fabricating a kidnapping that included detailed descriptions of abuse, all for the sake of maintaining her status as a victim. But it wasn't just the attention that drove Sherri, it was the way she crafted her story. She didn't just disappear, she returned with an elaborate narrative of captivity, claiming she had been kidnapped by 2 Hispanic women, beaten, starved, and branded. The racism embedded in her fabricated story, combined with her use of stereotypes about her supposed captors, suggested that Sherri wasn't just seeking any attention, she was positioning herself in a narrative that would evoke maximum sympathy from a largely white suburban audience. Her story played on fears of the unknown, the dangerous, other, and cast herself as the innocent suburban mother taken against her will. Sherri was fully aware of how to manipulate her surroundings, even from the moment she returned. She knew exactly how to present herself as a fragile, beaten-down victim who had miraculously survived weeks of terror, and for a while, she had everyone convinced. While attention seems to be a driving force behind Sherri's actions, the role of money cannot be ignored. In the aftermath of her disappearance, a GoFundMe page was set up to help with search efforts, raising nearly $50,000. Sherri also filed for compensation from the California Victim Compensation Board, requesting financial assistance for therapy, medical bills, and the trauma she claimed to have endured. By the time her scheme was uncovered, she had received over $30,000 in government assistance. But was money really the motivating factor behind Sherri's hoax? Or was it simply a side benefit of the attention she craved? Keith Papini himself has speculated that money wasn't the main goal. He believes that Sherri was driven by a need for attention, that she thrived on the concern and sympathy of others. It wasn't about the money, Keith has said. It was about people feeling for her, caring about her. She needed that validation, and she didn't care who she hurt in the process. Sherri's actions suggest that financial gain was secondary to the emotional fulfillment she received from being in the spotlight. The money was helpful, certainly, but it wasn't the main event. Her true currency was sympathy, and she was willing to pay any price, emotionally, mentally, and physically, to get it. Sherri's story isn't just one of lies and deception, it's a story of mental health, of psychological disorders that went undiagnosed and untreated for years. While many saw her as a manipulative liar, others saw a woman in deep psychological distress. The potential diagnoses of histrionic personality disorder and Munchausen syndrome by proxy offer a window into Sherri's mental state, a state in which attention and victimhood were intertwined in dangerous ways. By faking her abduction, Sherri not only hurt her family and her community, but she also set back efforts to address real victims of kidnapping and abuse. In crafting her elaborate lie, Sherri undermined the credibility of true survivors, those who had endured real trauma and sought real justice. Her actions had a ripple effect, one that extended far beyond her own family and into the broader social consciousness. The tragedy of Sherri Papini's story isn't just the lie, it's the why behind the lie. It's the mental health issues that went unaddressed, the attention-seeking behavior that spiraled out of control, and the impact it had on everyone around her. As we move forward, the question remains, could this have been prevented? Was there a way to intervene before Sherri's need for attention led her to destroy the lives of those closest to her? The ripple effects of Sherri Papini's actions extended far beyond her family and immediate community. One of the most troubling aspects of her fabricated story was the blatant racial stereotyping it involved. In the narrative she spun, Sherri claimed to have been abducted by two Hispanic women who she described in alarmingly stereotypical terms. She painted a picture of these women as violent and cruel, mentioning that they spoke Spanish, wore masks, and even blasted mariachi music during her captivity. This wasn't just a random choice of scapegoats, it was a dangerous narrative that played into pre-existing racial prejudices, fueling negative perceptions of the Hispanic community. At a time when tensions around immigration and race relations were already heightened, Sherri's lies added fuel to a fire that was already burning. The public, many of whom had supported her during the search, felt they had been manipulated into believing a story that not only wasn't true, but that also contributed to harmful racist stereotypes. Racial stereotyping in crime narratives isn't new. We've seen this pattern throughout history, where marginalized communities are often scapegoated for crimes they didn't commit. Sherri's story was no different. By falsely accusing Hispanic women, she perpetuated a long-standing and damaging tradition of blaming minority groups for violent acts. And in doing so, she created fear and suspicion where there should have been none. Many members of the Hispanic community spoke out about the harm Sherri's fabricated story caused. It wasn't just about the false accusation. Her story reinforced the perception of Hispanic people, especially women, as dangerous and untrustworthy. This kind of narrative has real-world consequences. It affects how people of color are treated in their communities, in the media, and by law enforcement. Sherri's lies didn't just harm her family, they harmed an entire community, casting a shadow that still lingers today. Sherri's lies didn't just stop at racial stereotyping. The betrayal felt by the public, especially those who donated to the GoFundMe page, participated in search efforts, and supported her family, was profound. Many people had poured their hearts and resources into helping what they believed was a desperate search for a missing mother. They rallied around the Papini family, organizing search parties, spreading awareness on social media, and donating nearly $50,000 to aid in the efforts to bring Sherri home. But when the truth came out, the sense of betrayal ran deep. The outrage wasn't just about the money, although that was certainly a part of it. People felt used. They had invested not only their finances, but also their emotions into the story of Sherri Papini. Mothers who identified with her as a suburban mom, just out for a jog, felt especially betrayed. Many had looked at Sherri as someone they could relate to, a fellow mother, a wife, living a life that mirrored their own. Her disappearance made them feel vulnerable, as though what had happened to her could have happened to them. When the truth was revealed, the public was left to grapple with the reality that this had all been a lie. Sherri Papini was not the innocent victim of a random, terrifying crime. She had manipulated the public's goodwill, spun a tale of horror, and pocketed thousands of dollars intended to aid in her recovery. And for what? The public wanted answers, but most of all, they wanted justice. While much of Sherri's hoax has been laid bare, there are still lingering questions that may never be fully answered. One of the most persistent is whether Keith Papini, her husband, was truly unaware of what was going on. Keith had stood by Sherri for months, defending her, speaking out publicly, and even organizing the GoFundMe campaign that raised so much money. But as more details about Sherri's lies came to light, some began to wonder, how much did Keith really know? Could he have been complicit in the deception, or was he just another victim of her manipulation? To this day, there is no hard evidence suggesting that Keith was involved in the hoax. But for many, his unwavering support for Sherri, even as the cracks in her story became obvious, raises questions. Was Keith simply blinded by love and loyalty, or did he ignore red flags that might have pointed to the truth? These are questions that have no definitive answers, and while Keith has maintained his innocence and eventually filed for divorce, the doubts linger in the minds of many who followed this case. Another question that remains is the long-term impact of Sherri's actions on their children. At the time of her disappearance, their 2 young children were shielded from the media storm. But as they grow older, they will inevitably learn the truth about their mother's hoax. What will the psychological impact be on them, knowing that their mother not only lied to the public, but also put their family at the center of a national scandal? How will they process the knowledge that their father, too, was a public figure in this lie, whether knowingly or unknowingly? And finally, the biggest unanswered question, why did Sherri do it? We've explored the psychological theories, from attention-seeking to possible mental health disorders. But the full picture of Sherri's motivation may never be entirely clear. What was it that drove her to such extremes? Was it truly a need for attention, or were there deeper issues at play, issues that even Sherri herself may not fully understand? The aftermath of Sherri Papini's hoax is still being felt today. The community in Redding, California, where people once rallied behind her, now grapples with a sense of betrayal. The people who gave their time, money, and emotional energy to support her have been left wondering if they will ever be able to trust a story like hers again. The damage done by Sherri's lies extends beyond her family. It erodes the trust between communities and those who seek help in times of crisis. As we come to the end of Sherri Papini's story, it's hard not to feel a profound sense of disbelief. What began as a seemingly tragic case of a suburban mother who went missing while jogging quickly unraveled into one of the most elaborate and disturbing hoaxes in recent memory. Sherri's lies weren't just a betrayal of her family, her friends, and her community. They were a betrayal of the very concept of trust. The consequences of her actions rippled outwards, touching everyone who believed in her story and felt compelled to help. Her husband Keith, her children, the law enforcement officers who spent countless hours investigating, and the public who rallied behind her were all victims in their own right. They were manipulated by a web of deceit that no one saw coming. Sherri's story captivated a nation because it played on our deepest fears, the idea that a loved one could disappear without a trace, taken by strangers in broad daylight. It also tapped into our desire to see a missing person returned home safely, a hope that was shattered when the truth came to light. In the end, Sherri's hoax cost her far more than the money she scammed through donations and victim compensation funds. It cost her the trust of her family, her community, and the public. And yet, for all the lies she told, the biggest question remains, why? Why would someone go to such extreme lengths to stage their own kidnapping, to fabricate a story so filled with pain and fear? Was it truly about attention, as some have speculated? Or were there deeper, more troubling psychological factors at play? Whatever the reason, one thing is certain, Sherri Papini's actions left a trail of devastation. Not only did her lies hurt those closest to her, but they also impacted real victims of crime. The resources and attention that went into searching for her could have been used to help those in genuine need. The damage caused by her false narrative, especially her scapegoating of Hispanic women, perpetuated harmful stereotypes and mistrust within the broader community. In reflecting on this case, it's clear that Sherri's story is a cautionary tale about the power of lies and the lengths some people will go to for attention or to escape the pressures of their own lives. It reminds us that not everything is as it seems on the surface, and that the consequences of deceit can be far-reaching and devastating. But perhaps one of the most important lessons we can take from this case is the importance of mental health support. While we may never fully understand why Sherri did what she did, it's evident that something deeper was wrong. Whether it was an undiagnosed mental health issue, a personality disorder, or a desperate cry for help, Sherri's actions signal a need for more awareness and resources around mental health, particularly in communities where these issues often go unaddressed. In the end, Sherri Papini's story leaves us with more questions than answers. And while justice has been served in the form of her legal repercussions, the emotional damage caused will likely linger for years to come. Her children will grow up knowing their mother orchestrated a hoax that captivated the nation, and her community will remember her as the woman who cried wolf in the most dramatic way possible. If you've listened up to this point, please leave a comment saying, "Done," and we'll personally thank you for your support. Thank you for tuning in to this deep dive into the case of the shocking disappearance of Sherri Papini, the truth behind the hoax that fooled America. We hope you found this episode as intriguing and thought-provoking as we did while creating it. If you enjoyed it, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think about this case? Was justice served? Share your opinions in the comments below. If you're interested in diving even deeper into the cases, we've included Amazon affiliate links in the description box. Purchasing through that link won't cost you anything extra, but it will help support our channel. And if you're hungry for more content, consider joining our Patreon community. There you'll find the full script of this episode and more content. You can even purchase the entire set of images featured in this episode through our Patreon store. This has been 22 Crime. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe.